So, dear listeners, thank you all for tuning in today. And today we have Quin Cho here ready with us. And before we get started about his research into the Kwantung Army, which was in Manchuria, which is northern China, um, during the interbellum, we would like to ask you what sparked your interest in the Second World War and also this topic.
So, my interest in the Second World War began when I was 9 years old, and I read this book by this woman named Linda Sue Park called When My Name Was Kyoko. It was about a Korean girl that grew up in Japanese-occupied Korea during the Second World War, and she wrote about her experiences, which were all very interesting, uh, especially considering the fact that I myself am of Korean descent. And I learned a lot from that book, and it spurred a strong interest in World War II, which I quickly found out was a rather global endeavor. Throughout middle school and high school, I transitioned to reading a lot about the various operations that defined the Second World War in the military sense, especially about the Soviet-German War, what the Russians called the Great Patriotic War, and also the Sino-Japanese War. Uh, these subjects were often less talked about in standard English language histories of the Second World War, but I was nonetheless able to find some pretty detailed campaign histories about both of these subjects. By 2020, I was in college at the University of Southern California in the midst of my freshman year, and I came across this organization, Pacific Atrocities Education, on the internet. I applied to be an intern. I received an internship and wrote my first book, entitled Competing Empires in Burma, a chronicle of the China-Burma-India theater of World War II. It's on Amazon if you want to buy it. But while I was in the process of completing this book in the fall of 2020, I'd taken a gap semester. I was consulting with my supervisor about other topics that I could conceivably write about. And the one that she came up with was the Kwantung Army. And I looked up, if there was any existing literature about the Kwantung Army, which was this Japanese army that was based in northeastern China, and as we will get into, was very much, in my estimation, responsible for the start of World War II in the Asia Pacific region. And sure enough, upon a Google search, there was no pre-existing literature in English explicitly about the Kwantung Army. And so I decided, along with my supervisor, to dedicate myself to try and writing a history about the Kwantung Army. And I'm one volume in now, with probably a couple more to go. And I'm going to do my best to tell this history as best I can in the English language.
So, for listeners unfamiliar with it, can you explain what the Kwantung Army was and its role in the regional and global history?
Yes, so the Kwantung Army was founded in 1906 in the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War as the Kwantung Garrison. Its primary role was to defend the Liaodong Peninsula, which the Japanese inherited as part of the Treaty of Portsmouth, which was signed in the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War, and also to defend the South Manchuria Railway, which was a railway that ran from Port Arthur to the city of Changchun, further up the Liaodong Peninsula. And these assets were had previously been Russian assets, but because of the successful outcome of the Russo-Japanese War, Japan inherited them, and the Kwantung Garrison, as it was called, was founded. In 1919, the Kwantung garrison became the Kwantung Army, and in the 20s, the Kwantung Army began supporting a fellow by the name of Zhang Zuolin, or the Old Marshal, one might say in English to kind of keep it, uh, I guess, more memorable. And the Old Marshal was, his role was to be a Japanese proxy of sorts to defend Japan's interests in Northeast China. So that is to say, not only the South Manchuria Railway and the Liaodong Peninsula, but also the various soybean and coal and iron uh, raw material interests, and also Japan's strategic interests, which namely were to prevent the unification of Northeast China with the rest of the country and or the potential encroachment of Soviet influence. The Kwantung Army actually went to great lengths to support Zhang Zuolin, the old marshal, in maintaining his position, including funding a uh, traitor in the opposing camp of the Zheli clique, which was at war with uh, the old marshal's Fengtian clique in 1924. The Kwantung Army funded this officer Feng Yuxiang to defect to Zhang Zuolin and betray his previous allegiance to the Zheli clique, and also in 1925 with the so-called Guo Songling affair, where in this time uh, a subordinate of the old marshal rebelled against him, and the Kwantung Army actually erected a 30-mile wide cordon to prevent his forces from crossing the Liao River and getting to the key city of Mukden. They forced him to take a longer route and thereby allowed the old marshal enough time to rally enough forces to uh, outflank and destroy Guo Songning's armies in the course of their rebellion. However, and despite the Kwantung Army's uh, intervention to protect Zhang Zuolin, which it is worth noting was done without orders from Tokyo and indeed in contradiction of official government policy, a colonel in the Kwantung Army named Komoto Daisaku assassinated Zhang in 1928, again without orders from Tokyo. This assassination of Zhang was done because Zhang was kind of, I guess, going off script, you might say, and supporting independent Chinese economic ventures and infrastructure projects. By 1931, the Kwantung Army took a further step as two colonels named Ishiwara Kanji and Itagaki Seishiro took it upon themselves, again without orders or support from Tokyo, to blow up the South Manchuria Railway. This triggered, which became known as the so-called Mukden incident, and led to a kind of successively uh, successively increasing in scope and scale invasion of northeastern China. This invasion of northeastern China led to the absorption of the region into the Japanese Empire and the establishment of Manchukuo, which kind of created the basis for economic exploitation and oppression in the region on the part of the Japanese Empire.
So it
During the
sounds
1930s, the Kwantung Army continued to encroach on northern China, uh, kind of triggering a process that led to the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. In 1939, it fought the Battle of Nomonhan, which was a clash with the Soviet Union. And by 1945, the war in the Asia-Pacific region ended with the Soviet Manchurian Strategic Offensive Operation, which saw the large-scale encirclement and destruction of the Kwantung Army. These are the main points that the Kwantung Army uh, was involved in during the Second World War and before it. And I think that it's very important in determining the flow and outcome of the conflict, especially in its early years.
So it sounds as if it wasn't just a military force, but it was also a political force that operated partially independent or against Tokyo's orders, as you said.
That's correct.
Yes. Could you tell us a bit more about the structure of this army and the strategy that they employed and how this differed from other military forces in its time?
That's a very good question. Uh, so I think it's worth noting the origins of the Kwantung Army's establishment which are in 1906 as the Kwantung Garrison. And this garrison was responsible to a governor general of the Liaodong Peninsula that oversaw both civilian and military administration. The governor general, in turn, was responsible to the foreign ministry and civilian government. This was the initial arrangement that the Kwantung garrison had with regards to Japan's civilian government. However, in 1919, the position of governor general was abolished by Japanese Prime Minister Harake, and the Kwantung Army was formed at Hara's behest as a separate military branch of administration. And there was also a separate civilian governorship of the Liaodong Peninsula. So basically, the military and civilian functions of the uh, key political military apparatus on the Liaodong Peninsula were hence separated. The new Kwantung Army was only responsible to the Army General Staff, the Army Ministry, and ultimately the Emperor, as according to the 1889 Meiji Constitution, the Japanese Army ultimately answered to the Emperor. However, due to its, uh, I guess, positioning on the Asian mainland and the Emperor's uh, lack of ability to control the Kwantung Army, and in turn also the Army General Staff's and Army Ministry's lack of ability to control the Kwantung Army, it was in practice often able to act independently without and or despite orders. Uh, this phenomenon was part of a broader phenomenon in the Imperial Japanese Army known as Gekokujo, which literally means the lower overcoming the higher, or you might say insubordination in English, where field grade officers oftentimes took the initiative on their own to effect change in Northeast China, and in their mind, expand and better maintain Japan's empire in the region. The most notable instances of Geikokujo in the Kwantung Army include the assassination of the old marshal in 1928, which, as I previously stated, was done without orders from Tokyo, and indeed, despite the contradiction of official government policy. The Mukden incident in 1931, which entailed a false flag attack on the Japanese-owned South Manchuria Railway to catalyze an invasion of the rest of northeastern China. A variety of other incidents thereafter, which kind of led to the expansion of the Mukden incident uh, towards outside of the immediate sphere of the South Manchuria Railway. A series of incursions into northern China, including the invasion of Yehou or Rehe province immediately to the west, and the invasion of Suiyuan in 1936. Again, these were the initiatives of field officers and done without official approval from the Army General Staff or government in Tokyo. And indeed, in 1939, during the Battle of Nomonhan, there was a famous instance where a Japanese staff officer named Tsuji Masanobu conducted an airstrike into Outer Mongolia, which was not Japanese territory, uh, again, without orders from Tokyo. And indeed, despite knowing full well that Tokyo would probably not approve of this airstrike, and and he conducted this airstrike, and the Kwantung Army actually crossed the border into uh, Outer Mongolia for a brief moment in July of 1939 in an attempt to resolve a border dispute. This rather severely escalated Japanese-Soviet tensions and led to an escalation of the broader Battle of Nomonhan. Uh, these instances all uh, illustrated the kind of boldness of the Kwantung Army's Gekokujo, and also its unwillingness to obey the set policies of the Japanese government in Tokyo, and indeed even the higher echelons of the army. This boldness was also reflected in the Kwantung Army's willingness to take on great risks, attacking forces that significantly outnumbered itself. To give kind of concrete figures to this, the Kwantung Army, when it invaded northeast China, numbered somewhere around just over 10,000 men, and its Chinese opponents in the realm of northeast China in the young marshal's army, this was the old marshal's son, numbered somewhere in the region of 130 to 140,000. Uh, this willingness to take on great odds while successful in the 30s, because the Kwantung Army was able to defeat disparate uh, non-resisting Chinese garrisons separately or in detail, and concentrate large force against disparate smaller ones, was not ultimately sustainable, as Japan made more and more enemies in form of, especially in the form of China and eventually the Soviet Union and the Western powers as well. And eventually, the Kwantung Army's insubordination and strategic boldness led to the path of war in East Asia and the Kwantung Army's ultimate demise in 1945, along with the rest of the Japanese Empire.
You already answered part of the next question, but I'm curious, what role did the Kwantung Army play in shaping events which led up to the Second World War as we know it?
That is a very good question. So I think some further detail might be useful in kind of filling in the blanks, if you will, of everything that happens in the 30s. Uh, I think that after the Mukden incident in 1931 and the absorption of Northeast China and the establishment of Manchukuo, the Kwantung Army began to look west at various provinces in northern China to try and salami slice these into um, separate balkanized regions. The it helped that the Chinese KMT under Chiang Kai-shek had adopted a non-resistance policy, or a first pacification, then resistance policy, as it might be called, which prioritized fighting the Chinese communists over creating a united front to resist Japan and the Kwantung Army's incursions. The Chinese non-resistant or first pacification then resistance policy emboldened the Kwantung Army and led to its attack on Rehe province or Yeho province in 1933 to protect the flank of Manchukuo and also to get greater access to coal and iron mines in this region. While the KMT did put up some resistance, it was ineffectual, as the forces that were defending this province were pretty unprepared for a Kwantung Army attack. And so subsequently, the Kwantung Army was able to rapidly establish control over Rehe or Yeho province. After this attack into Rehe or Yeho, the Kwantung Army and its uh, kind of compatriot North China Garrison Army began fomenting ethnic and regional separatism in northern China, including the provinces of Hebei, Chahar, and Suiyuan. Uh, this kind of ethnic and regional separatism and the kind of fomentation of these phenomena culminated in 1936 in the Suiyuan incident, where the Kwantung Army, again without support from Tokyo, uh, funded and armed this Inner Mongolian separatist army to invade the province of Suiyuan in Inner Mongolia. This invasion failed, but it led to the kidnapping of Chiang Kai-shek by the young marshal, the old marshal's son, who at this point was forced out of northeastern China, and led to the formation of a united front between Chiang Kai-shek, the communists, and the various other disparate warlords in other parts of China, and the temporary end of China's civil war, ostensibly to resist Japan and Japanese aggression. By July 1937, Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT, along with the rest of the Chinese political scene, was no longer willing to accept the Kwantung Army's salami slicing and slow balkanization of northern China. And so when another incident broke out in July of 37, the so-called Marco Polo Bridge incident, it quickly escalated into full-scale war between China and Japan. As the Imperial Japanese Army was not able to defeat the Chinese quickly, it had estimated that it could do so in 2 to 3 months, but could not because of the size of China and the Chinese army's, I guess, feistier operational uh, exercise than the Japanese had supposed. The Japanese ran out of key raw materials, most notably rubber and tin, and eventually, after the Americans put sanctions on Japan, oil and scrap metal. So they had to look elsewhere to obtain these raw materials. By 1941, the Japanese settled on a strike south policy to attack European colonies in Southeast Asia and in order to acquire these items. The U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and the U.S. occupied Philippines were potential impediments to the strike south policy because U.S. forces in these places could have conceivably intervened to hinder Japan's strike south. Hence, the Japanese resolved not only to attack European colonies such as the Dutch East Indies or British Malaya or Singapore or Myanmar, Burma, but also the U.S. occupied Philippines and the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese implemented this strike on all these regions, this simultaneous strike, I might add, on all these areas and regions in December 1941, which led to the war breaking out in the Asia Pacific region. So, in summary, the war in the Asia Pacific region can be directly traced back to the Mukden incident of 1931, but with many steps along the ladder that led to the eventual culmination of the war.
It actually made me curious because you mentioned a lot of different nationalities, the Chinese, how they were divided, Korean people. Could you tell us a bit about how these different experiences are reflected in your book?
Of course, so my book is to 1932, and in the second volume, there'll be quite a bit of information on the experiences of different ethnic groups and northeastern China and Japan's weaponization of uh, ethnic separatism and ethnic minorities to try and expand its empire. So actually, it's worth noting that from the 1910s and the initiation of the Chinese Revolution of 1911 and the dissolution of the Qing dynasty, the Japanese and the Kwantung Army tried to weaponize the presence of ethnic minorities, and most notably Mongols and Manchus at that time, to separate Northeast China from the rest of China. They tried to foment separatism. As I mentioned previously, they continued working from this playbook in the 1920s and 30s to balkanize or salami slice northeast and northern China uh, on the basis of Manchu or Mongolian or Korean separatism. If you look at a lot of the Kwantung Army's planning documents prior to the Mukden incident, they talk about creating an accord of five races in Northeast China, a kind of multiracial state where each ethnic group has their own kind of domain. So, like, I think for the Chinese, they would have uh, like small shopkeeping, for instance, and Koreans might have rice agriculture, and very conveniently, the Japanese would control big capital firms and industries in their kind of, I guess, the ideal Kwantung Army uh, satellite state of in northeastern China. Or at least this was the vision that was enunciated in these documents. Uh, It's also worth noting that in my book, I talk about how the Kwantung Army weaponized the presence of Koreans in northeast China, many of whom were there because they had fled Japanese colonial rule, but they nonetheless alleged, with some justification, mistreatment by local Chinese authorities, but they used this to try and assert and expand Japan's uh, extraterritorial rights in northeast China. The extraterritorial rights, for reference, uh, were universally agreed upon as having, or the Chinese had been forced to agree upon their Japan's extraterritorial rights on the Liaodong Peninsula and the South Manchuria Railway. But Japan in 1915 had kind of imposed these 21 demands on China, which expanded Japan's rights and interests in Manchuria to include much of the rest of the region, to settle, to pan for minerals, to build industries, uh, things of that nature. And the Japanese used the presence of Koreans to try and uh, expand these interests and to kind of legitimate the 21 demands, which most in China did not recognize because they were done under the threat of the use of force. So one of the examples of the Kwantung Army weaponizing Koreans to whip up kind of anti-Chinese frenzy in Korea and Japan was the so-called Wanpaoshan incident, which I write about in my book. Basically, these Koreans, they bought some land from this Chinese broker on, it was Chinese land, but there were two versions of a contract that they signed, and according to the laws of the local province, they would have to await the approval of the local Chinese authorities uh, for the purchase and for it to go through. Uh, the Koreans were not made aware of this by the Chinese broker, and so they kind of, after receiving their version of the contract, began digging irrigation ditch across actually even Chinese-owned land, and this upset some local Chinese, and the situation very quickly escalated. into an armed standoff between local Japanese consular police and the Chinese police and gendarme in the area. And this was seized upon by the Japanese press in Korea and in Japan as proof of the insolent nature of the Chinese and how they were disrespecting uh, Japanese authority in the region. What the Japanese saw as their rightful treaty-bound authority from the 21 demands. And this was it created a big stir of anti-Chinese feeling in Japan and in Korea, where there were anti-Chinese riots, and it helped create a atmosphere that would readily embrace the Kwantung Army's eventual invasion of Northeast China. It helped manufacture consent, if you will, among the Japanese public for this, even though uh, the Japanese, of course, were not sincere in their desire to help Koreans in Northeast China or anyone else for that matter, as after the establishment of Manchukuo, Koreans, Chinese, Mongolians, Manchus were all subject to the regime of economic exploitation, social control, deprivation, and degradation that was to define Japanese rule in the region, in which I will cover in more depth in my next volume. So, in summary, even though there was a lot of weaponization of ethnic minorities in northeastern China, the Japanese had very little interest in actually improving the condition of these peoples.
And that leads me to the final question of the interview. What do you hope readers will take away from reading your book?
That's the $1 million question, right? What do I want people to remember? Um, I think that it's important to remember that the Kwantung Army was a cog in the machine of the Japanese Empire. It was certainly an insubordinate a cog. It was uh, certainly willing to take measures on its own to expand the Japanese Empire and ensure that and or maintain it is or try to maintain it is which often involved expansion in the minds of Kwantung Army radical officers. But I think it's still worth noting that the Kwantung Army is a part of the empire and is a branch of the empire, and the actions that it undertook were ultimately for the empire, and insofar as and so long as they expanded the empire, uh, the Japanese decision makers, both military and civilian, in the homeland, by and large, were willing to embrace the results of the Kwantung Army's insubordinate activities. Um, the Kwantung Army's false flag attacks won support at home for its ventures and acquiescence abroad for Japan for its aggression against Northeast China and Northern China. These were these false flag attacks on the South Manchuria Railway, which was uh, blown up and by the Kwantung Army and blamed on local Chinese forces, were critical into kind of winning legitimacy and creating a cause for war in Northeast China, and would eventually be repeated both in the course of the invasion of Northeast China, which kind of progressed in stages, and elsewhere in Northern China. Uh, Nonetheless, despite the Kwantung Army's uh, insubordination and its still successful absorption of Northeast China and parts of Northern China, uh, its continuous mission creep and expansion of the kind of scope of its hostilities made enemies for the Japanese Empire and made too many enemies, I might add, uh, in the form of China, the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union. And this illustrates the folly and the fallacy of the Kwantung Army's approach to strategy, which could just basically prioritized achieving security through expansion and instead of working through peaceful means or diplomatic means first to try and ensure Japan's economic and strategic interests, the Kwantung Army consistently utilized force to try and realize Japan's uh, economic and strategic aims, which uh, was ultimately a way to get involved in a unwinnable war with a wide variety of different powers in the Asia Pacific region. This fallacy led to the illustrated the dangers of civilians losing control over the military and the problems that accompany prioritizing short-term conquests over long-term strategy.
Okay.
Uh, and I think that because the Kwantung Army's actions in northeast and northern China led to the outbreak of World War II in the Asia Pacific region, it is a cautionary tale of what happens when a when an armed force acts as a policy-making agent in in outside of the realm of the government and outside of the control of the government and the higher echelons of the armed forces.
Okay. I apologize for the brief interruption, but please continue with talking.
Yeah, I have no final comments. Um, I think I've been very pleased to come on this podcast and uh, meet with the good people at World War II Daily. And if you want to buy my book, it's on Amazon, The Rise of the Kwantung Army, Japan's Empire in Manchuria to 1932. And I greatly appreciate the privilege of being able to come on here.
I do have another question. Could you tell us a bit more about the organization that you work for?
Yeah, the organization I work for is Pacific Atrocities Education. It is a nonprofit based in San Francisco, California, and our mission is to try and inform English-speaking audiences about the Second World War in the Asia Pacific region, whether it's the atrocities that were committed or the uh, nature of military operations that occurred. We seek to bring these often untold or undertold histories to an English-speaking audience.
From my perception, like, is this in the form of like books that you write, but is it also educational material for perhaps teachers, or is it also information for the general audience?
It is in the form of books, it's in the form of videos, it's in the form of blog posts on the website of Pacific Atrocities Education, and it's on the form of social media posts. We actually had a conference on September 18th of this year to commemorate the 94th anniversary of the Mukden incident, the false flag attack on the South Manchuria Railway that led to the invasion of Northeast China. And I gave a talk there on the content of my book, as did some others on various topics relating to the Japanese Empire and the war in the Asia Pacific region. So that's the some of the mediums through which PAE attempts to amplify its message.
So if people wish to know more about World War II in Asia, that's the place they should get started.
Yep, you go to pacificatrocities.org. or Pacific Atrocities Education.org. Excuse me. The last word will be required. But yeah, you should find a lot of information about Pacific Atrocities Education on the website.
We'll put the link in the description. Okay,
Yep.
thank you for attending, and to the audience, thank you for listening. We hope to see you in the next episode. And Quinn, who knows? Once your next book is out, we hope to see you again in the future.
I hope to come back.
Bye bye.
Yep.
Hey, hello everyone. Thank you for coming all the way to the end of the episode. Consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. It helps us a lot and it's for free. And if you change your mind, you can just unsubscribe. There's no problem. Okay. We are coming with a new episode every month, so stay tuned. And every time with a different topic. This last one was extremely interesting. I learned a lot, and I'm pretty sure you did as well. And Quinn, thank you very much for attending, for teaching us so much. I really enjoyed watching the interview. A special thanks to Samuel, who conducted the interview brilliantly, and another special thanks to the Pacific Atrocities Education and to Jenny, who's been extremely supportive and helping us to get all these fantastic interviews. And all the links are here in the description of this episode. You can check them out, and I encourage you checking their website and also the link to Quinn's book. If you want to read it, you can find the link down here. Okay, guys. So I guess I'll see you. I'll see you on the next episode of the World War II Daily podcast. Bye bye.